Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on the History Valley podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Robyn Faith Walsh. And today's topic is based on Robyn's book titled "The Origins of Early Christian Literature: Contextualizing the New Testament Within Greco-Roman Literary Culture." The book will be in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment if you want to go purchase yourself a copy. And with that being said, thank you for joining me today, Robyn.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for joining me. So, for those that haven't seen your previous appearances on this channel and others, and don't know about your work, can you give a brief recap regarding what your book is about?
Sure. So I was trying to figure out why it is the case that we tend to talk about early Christian literature, and specifically here I talk about the canonical Gospels, and even narrowing it down further, I talk about the Synoptic Gospels for reasons that I can expand upon in a minute. But I was trying to figure out why there is a tendency for us to imagine communities behind these texts. Now, some of it is obvious. We like to try to reconstruct as much of early Christian history as we can. And so to think about different churches that may have used these Gospels makes a fair amount of sense. We do know eventually this is how they are used. It's how they're used today. But that seemed a little contrary to my mind to how we talk about literature saying classics, right? We don't talk about Philodemus's assumed community as the example I give in text, or someone like Philo, who are also talking about religion, talking about famous figures, but not, or philosophy, but not, we don't really try to reconstruct whatever religious community was around them. So it seemed to me that we were sort of making a category mistake to some extent, in the sense that we were just assuming that when the gospel writers were writing, they were writing for communities. So I wanted to explore that a little bit more. And what I came up with in the book is that we probably are overestimating the degree to which we can imagine or reconstruct an early Christian community behind these texts. And the reason for that has to do with literacy in the ancient world. It's fairly limited. We probably can imagine a literary community of other people who could read and write around these authors, but to assume that they're just sort of faithfully recording the oral traditions and teachings of Jesus that they're passing on amongst each other might be a step too far. Or at the very least, we need to maybe add some complexity to that model. And so I wanted to test what would happen if we imagined a literary community as more primary for these writers rather than a religious one. And so in doing that, I started to identify, as you've asked me to come on and talk about today, different parallels within Greco-Roman literature that I thought were very telling and revealed that the gospel writers were really participating in something that was very normal in the ancient world, which was not faithfully recording a history per se, but demonstrating the importance of Jesus through literary technique. And so I do a lot of different comparisons with things like the Satyricon, for example, where you have a story about three men crucified and an empty tomb, where you have the story of Trimalchio, where he hears a cock crow and predicts his death and has his testament to his friends at a dinner party that they should eat his body after his death. I mean, just to give I'm sure we'll mine down on these examples, and we have talked about some of them before, but those to me suggested that these authors were, maybe we could say, filling in the blanks at times with literary technique, or telling a story the way that audiences would have expected a story to be told in antiquity. In other words, something like the empty tomb, which, Richard Miller has also talked about. When you have an empty tomb or a missing body after the death of your hero in a story, or in visual culture as well, so thinking here about something like the Arch of Titus, when you have that kind of apotheosis, would you have it in the Greek novel? It means that that person has a new sort of more exalted status, or we might say kind of superhuman status. They're a god. They've become a god. So little clues like that throughout the story, even things like the birth narratives, when you get to Luke and Matthew, indicating, this extraordinary birth. In Luke, you have clues in terms of cosmology. All of these things you can find elsewhere in Greek and Roman literature. So it wasn't that I was trying to, again, downplay the idea that there were early Christians who appreciated these texts, circulated these texts, found them important. I really wanted to think about what the experience of the writers would have been and to kind of offer a new perspective where we could maybe have some new conversations in the field around that.
What do you make of Platonizing Christians?
Do you mean like the Gnostic way, or Christians using Plato?
I guess I'm asking about both.
Okay. Well, I think that, going all the way to Paul, Paul is very steeped in philosophy. And, I think some people would say he's a Middle Platonist, to the extent that we use that category. I think, according to some people who study philosophy and, the Roman world, I'm thinking here about Elizabeth Rawson. She points out that Josephus says that anybody who's a Platonist is kind of laughed out of the room by the late first century because Stoicism becomes so popular. But you still see some of the aspects of Platonism in terms of things like dualities, which is what comes across in something like the Gospel of John, just off the top of my head. And I don't think these early Christian texts really, they don't, they do display an interest in Platonizing ideas, but that's normal for this time period. And I think certainly the gospel authors, and again, Paul, understand Greek and Roman philosophy. So I think that we have to be aware that a lot of the terminology that maybe gets sort of a theological casting in our translations today, we have to be attentive to whether or not Plato might be an inspiration, or someone, like one of the Stoic authors, or Stoic physics could be involved. And a scholar I really like on this topic is Emma Wasserman, who has several books, and including her dissertation book from a few years ago, where she points out that, there are a lot of strategies, Platonic rhetorical strategies that, for example, Paul uses. And then to the extent that we might imagine the gospel authors also reflecting on Paul and, again, having these kinds of philosophical conversations, I think that it's very present. Now, what happens later with quote unquote Gnosticism? From what I understand, that term's having a comeback, but I'm still pretty persuaded by Karen King's What is Gnosticism book that identifies that category as a later category that's all tied up with ideas of orthodoxy and heresy. So I think we have to have a more, I think I said this about the Gospels too, but expansive view. I think we want to try to, as much as we can, divorce ourselves from these later categorizations and the later polarizing conversations that happened about orthodoxy and heresy. So I hope that answers your question, but that's where I feel.
It does.
That's how I feel about Platonizing Christians.
So would you connect Paul within the Greco-Roman literary milieu?
Yeah, that's how he's been trained. And I would say that even since I wrote the book, and, I've had a few new articles come out, and I'm writing 2 or 3 monographs right now simultaneously, which is probably a bad idea. But I am, I have too many ideas. But one thing I'm starting to lean toward more is, back to kind of this principle of how were these writers trained, or how did they go to school? And I think that tends to answer a lot. Because I always want to be aware that ancient authors didn't have the same access to everything we have access to. And especially now with databases and the Loeb Classical Library and things like that, it's very easy for me to be like, oh, that reminds me of this thing, or to use the TLG to look up words. And then I just assume somebody had access to a particular text. I think I have to be careful about that. And also, we have to be aware that there are a lot of texts that we've lost, obviously. So Phlegon of Tralles that we've talked about before, or Tralles that we've talked about before, apparently he wrote about Christians, but that's lost, for example. And so I'm interested in thinking more about trends that I could identify maybe in education or training that would tell me something about why a certain motif or topos makes its way into the way that an ancient writer constructs their narrative. So somebody like Plato, or for example, Homer, I can anticipate Paul, who clearly knows Greek. He's been trained in, the rhetorical exercises. He seems to be well aware, of those traditions, and he's deploying them and using the terminology. I I don't know that I can always, I could pretty much tell he's read the Republic, for instance. um, but like, of course, right? So some of those texts, I think you can have a reasonable assumption that they would have had homework assignments where they would have to read Euripides, Homer, Plato. Um, and so there, I think you can start to see a general kind of training and ethos of education. And so that's where I kind of lie with Paul. I think you can see with him that he has been trained in certain traditional ways for the rhetorical exercises, with the caveat that I don't think we know as much about what it meant to be a Pharisee in the diaspora and to be educated at the time, which is also something that I've been trying to work on. Often we have to go to rabbinic literature to try to reconstruct some of that history, but that's always a bit perilous, whether it's within Jewish studies or Christian studies. So one thing I'm particularly interested in these days is the reputation of Tarsus as an educational center in antiquity, because it's Acts that tells us Paul is from Tarsus. Paul doesn't tell us that himself, but Tarsus was a center of learning, a well-known area where philosophy was a big deal, right? So to be able to reconstruct, who else is from Tarsus? We know some ancient librarians who were from Tarsus and other figures, and what we mean by Tarsus is one thing, for example, that I think is an interesting new path to take.
How is Mark's gospel not much help?
Okay, so, Mark is it's my favorite gospel, I think. And in part because it's doing something very curious, which is, he has this construction of Jesus where no one seems to understand who he is for half of the gospel. He performs these acts or gives these teachings or does something else that's wondrous. And, these crowds and the disciples are like, who is this guy, over and over again? Also, having translated some of it I had an ambition at one point to do a commentary and translation. So, back in the day, I was trying to go through it very carefully to do a translation. And, the sentence structures and, its composition is a little strange in some ways. It kind of reminded me of something like the Tablet of Cebes. And so looking at it that way, if you're trying to reconstruct a Christian community, it doesn't give you much, actually. To do any of that kind of work, I think you have to sort of call him eschatological, or you have to do a comparison with somebody like Matthew or Luke to say, how do they change him? And then you can kind of reverse engineer some claims about Mark and community. But I don't think Mark itself as a gospel, if you want to do a kind of methodological mirror reading of, what community constructed this gospel based on Jesus's teachings, based on the structure, I find that exceptionally odd in a way to try to do with this particular text, because the esotericism seems to be the point. And more recently, I wrote a piece for the new quest, or the next quest for the historical Jesus, where I pointed out actually what the Gospel of Mark reminds me of is what you see in Homer and Virgil when the hero is I don't know if misrecognized is a word off the top. I think it is. I think I used it. But he's not recognized right away, especially when he comes home, which is interesting for, we have a teaching of Jesus saying, a prophet's not appreciated, especially in his hometown. So I think that whole tenor of the gospel is very interesting, but also back to what we were saying with education, really corresponds with a technique that you would have learned in school. Somebody would have noticed that Homer and other writers have this idea of the hero who is not recognized immediately. The example I gave in the piece I wrote for the next quest was Virgil and the various heroes that come into town, and you have crowds that are bewildered. The word that is often used is thalma, which is also the word that's used in Mark. And so we've been very influenced historically by this scholar named William Verda, who talked about the messianic secret. And so instead of talking about literary technique, Verda talked about kind of the psychology of Jesus. I don't know if he was like a Freudian, I'm not quite sure, but he talks about the psychology of Jesus and the theological aim of having Jesus not recognized being something we might call like a low Christology, for example, just to kind of give a brief description. And so then you could use that to say, well, this was a Christian community with a low Christology that, was interested in Jesus's suffering and human processes. But I don't think that's what's going on in terms of literary technique. That's a theological interpretation that I think is relevant to a much later understanding of that gospel, not its composition. So I think that Mark's not much help for community, but it is interesting in terms of literary technique.
In the reverse, is it helpful in kind of speaking on the literary technique you just mentioned in terms of like understanding the Greco-Roman connections?
Yeah, I think that Mark and Luke, probably to my mind, are the most obvious in that realm. I think that they demonstrate the most adherence to a certain kind of technique, at least in my mind. And Luke is more obvious, more obviously in ancient biography in terms of its structure with like a birth narrative and, so forth. So I think that they definitely demonstrate that. I mean, you can make the case for the others as well if we're just talking about the canon. But maybe it's not quite as transparent structurally as it is, as again, at least in my mind with Mark and Luke. But that's something people would debate.
What was the romantic Big Bang and the inheritance of the German methodology?
Well, one thing I also did in the book was not just focus on the ancient world, but ask the question, well, how did we get here? Like at what point can we identify in the history of scholarship where it made sense to talk about communities instead of authors? And one place that I ended up really focusing in on was the German Romantic movement, which is, if you think about the academy itself, it's not critical study of religion is not that old, actually. And when we think about the university system today, it is inspired or informed or an inheritor of what was going on in the German universities of the Romantic period as well. And one strategy of the Romantic period that had all kinds of relevance for things like nationalism, which we don't have to get into, but was this idea of retrieving oral stories from different folk, so different peoples. And so this was something that the Germans did with the example I give in the book is the Grimm fairy tales. For example, it's something everybody is pretty much familiar with, but that was an attempt to retrieve the otherwise unrecorded oral stories of the German people. Now you mine down into that, and there have been many books. It turns out the Grimm brothers weren't really formally trained. They stole a lot of stories from the French, but like whatever, like we'll bracket that for a second. But this idea that you could find the oral stories of a people, whether it's Shakespeare with the Brits or it's the Grimm brothers with the Germans and so forth. And so those methodologies, I think you can see how they were then applied to the Gospels as well at a time when strict disciplinarity wasn't really a thing. If you were a scholar of literature, ancient literature, there would be no problem with you sort of dancing around, maybe trying one methodology with German literature and then trying the same thing with the Gospels. And so the idea of a spokesperson, a genius author who represents, the oral stories of the folk was very much something that was normalized as a methodology at a time when the critical study of the Bible is coming up. And so therefore, I think reinforced this idea that if we're going to recreate early Christian history, that this was a legitimate means of doing so without really having to mine down, in the case of the Gospels, into actually, the technique and the writing habits and networks of those authors.
What is Herder's schema for language and myth foregrounds?
Well, he was one of the main examples that I gave, and he's fairly famous. I think one of the texts that I talk about in that chapter is his spirit of Hebrew poetry, the Geist of Hebrew poetry. And so one thing that he puts forward is the idea that, and this was not exclusive to Herder. This was something that was very common in German Romantic thinking, but that language itself really embodied a people. and could explain a lot about those people. So I'm not going to say everything he concludes about the Jewish people, which he's talking about. He's in some ways complimentary of the active form of the language and the verbs and how crackly it is. He talks about at one point, and but he makes some kind of, I would say, unsavory conclusions about Jewish people as a result of those observations. And this is part of a larger schema where there was an attempt in some corners of German scholarship to reconstruct Aryan history, but extract Jewish history from that trajectory. So there's a lot going on there that I can't quite get into. But the idea that a language represents a people became part, I think, of what was going on with early Christianity, in particular, translation. So there is a tradition that continues today where if you're going to translate New Testament Greek, and that's the terminology that's used, you need a different lexicon than what you would use in, say, a classics course where you're translating Koine from someone else, or even just, translating, Epictetus, just to throw it off the top of my head. You're going to use a different dictionary because words mean different things for Christians. And that effectively, first of all, that's not the case. Right? You can actually understand Paul much better, or Mark much better, if you use what we call the middle little, the Liddell and Scott. Like if you use an actual Greek dictionary that has the definitions that everybody's using, because Paul's borrowing words like ecclesia from a pre-existent vocabulary and he's deploying it in the same way. There's just later theological interpretations of certain words that then make their way into a New Testament lexicon. But that does not get you at what we're talking about here, which is Christian beginnings, right? Like how do we reconstruct the development of this movement? So this idea that there's a separate language for Christianity, that it has its own people and language, really established this idea of Christian nationalism in a sense, that I think gives it a foundation by making these kinds of claims about it in antiquity that puts it on par with what we're talking about with, Herder trying to identify the language of the Jewish people or the language of the German people. And then you have a language of Christians, especially in antiquity, which is, I think, all part of a project of drawing these divisions that end up having all kinds of, as you know, pernicious effects in history, culminating especially in World War II.
What connections do you see between Luke and Virgil?
So I see this Thalma motif we were talking about in particular. And, Virgil deploys it. He most likely gets it also from Homer as a literary technique. But I give the example of Camilla in this piece that I wrote that I mentioned before called City and Country for the Next Quest. Because Camilla is a very subversive figure. She's a woman, but she's a warrior. And over again, when she appears, she's described as causing bewilderment and wonder to the people who see her. And the language is very, very similar to the Gospel of Mark when Jesus performs a certain kind of action and the people around him are bewildered and struck by wonder. And so I actually just go through in that piece, and I think I give maybe 3 or 4 examples where you can compare and contrast how someone like Virgil is using the same sort of language. He's writing in Latin, obviously, but it's the same kind of motif, right? And I picked Camilla in particular because I liked that idea of the figure being also subversive, that the hero is also subversive in some way. So Camilla being a woman who's a warrior, and Jesus being a Messiah who's crucified. Right, so you have a certain inversion of expectation as well with these 2 figures. So I thought that was a really fruitful way to reimagine what Mark's objectives as a writer might have been. And the other nice thing about Virgil, too, is, obviously we're talking about writing in a similar time period. So not just going all the way back to Homer. Perfectly good reasons to do that. But also demonstrating that Mark, I don't know, we might say is like au courant in his approach to trying to appeal to a readership of some kind.
Do you see not only Luke, but Matthew having a genealogy of Jesus being akin to Greco-Roman genealogies of their dying rising gods? If so, what examples could you refer to for this?
The dying and rising god motif is something I'd want to think more about. I know that kind of comes in and out of fashion at times. Certainly, the kind of genealogy that's given in both. They're interesting for their own reasons, each one of them. But that is very typical, I think, particularly in something, not only the biographical tradition, but also, to me, the paradoxographical tradition. Let me try to say that again without tripping over it. The paradoxographical tradition. Um, because you do see in paradoxography this tendency to, I'm thinking about Luke here in particular, account for time according to when, like, such and such a council was in office in such and such a time, this extraordinary thing happened. And you see that kind of recording with birth narratives too. It's also interesting to me, and I apologize for kind of going off a track here a little bit, but
That's
even
fine.
something like Luke's preface, right? That kind of dedication we see in the writings of people like retired generals or physicians who will say something like, I've read all these books that claim to have cures for X, Y, and Z. And after reading all of these, I've decided, patron X, to write you a more thorough account of how to deal with gout or whatever it is, right? There's at least one example I can think of off the top of my head where that happens. And so you are seeing, whatever the influence was, a paradoxographical tradition, a biographical tradition, they're fitting into it. One thing to go off track a little bit, but that also occurs to me, is that something like Luke's preface, which obviously, is part of this opening series of vignettes about Jesus's birth, or, right before that, that kind of structure you also see in the works of people like ancient physicians who will say something along the lines of, I've read a variety of accounts of how to do a particular kind of medicinal treatment or particular kinds of healing. So the accounts of other physicians, and then a mention of patron X. And then I'll say, but I have put together a more faithful accounting of how to treat this particular problem. So I actually could show you one example that this example I actually got from Francois Bauvin's Hermania commentary on the Gospel of Luke. He kind of embedded it in a footnote, but I think that it's helpful. So hold on one second. Let me share screen if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay. Right, so ignore everything else. I gotta open this one. Can you see this?
Not yet. I see it now.
So this is from Dioscorides from the 1st century CE. Although many reports have been made, not only in the past but also recently, about the production, effects, and testing of medicines, I nevertheless intend to instruct you, dear Arios, about them. The decisions to undertake such a thing is neither needless nor injudicious, for some of my predecessors have not completed their works, and others have written most things down from hearsay. So if you're familiar with Luke's preface, this is going to seem pretty familiar to you in terms of structure, right?
Oh,
So
yeah.
that's the kind of thing in thinking about Matthew or Luke, or thinking about, again, how they're structuring their pieces, whether it's something like the genealogies or something like this preface, there's a certain familiarity there. So not saying that I necessarily know Luke read a bunch of treatments of physicians, but isn't it interesting that later on Luke is associated with being a physician, right? And you see this kind of preface, you can start to understand why those sorts of conclusions might have seemed natural to a Greek speaker in antiquity. Like, well, we see this kind of preface all the time from physicians. He uses medical terminology elsewhere. He must be a physician, right? So it's not something I would necessarily put in print, but it's the kind of thought experiment I think is interesting with those kinds of questions.
Sure. What do we know about authorship in antiquity in general?
Well, we have to rely to some extent on the testimony of some pretty elite individuals. And here I mean elite in terms of also economics as well as social standing. So, we're a little bit limited to some extent in imagining how some of these practices might have, I don't know, we might say trickled down to other tiers of society. I think that there are scholars like Candida Moss and John Kloppenborg who have done a lot of great work on this to help us understand the activities of, or Bill Arnall too comes to mind, about scribes, ancient scribes, or in Candida Moss's case, her recent book on enslaved writers and enslaved individuals having to participate in authorship practices. So I think attentiveness to those currents are very important as well. But that writing, reading at a level that we see displayed in something even like the Gospels was the purview of very few, relatively speaking. Obviously, there's no requirement to go to school, and so you have to have a certain amount of latitude in your life, your social standing, to participate in that kind of activity, to spend the time that it would take to read and write. If you're economically elite, you're going to enslave people or employ people to do a lot of that work for you. Actually, we see this with Paul, and Moss has written an article about this, where Paul at one point says, look what large letters I'm using. When I write with my own hand, it means that he had a scribe, whether, he funded it or a patron funded it. This is a laborious process in many ways that not everybody would participate on their own. And then you also have those people like enslaved individuals who are trained in these practices, not at their own liberty, but in order to serve some other function in a household for an individual who wants to participate in these practices for whatever reason. And then in the 2nd century, we do have some evidence here. I'm thinking about the work of someone like David Constant, of more people, probably because of economic reasons, but it's something that I'd want to, work some more on in terms of research, where you do have a wider readership in some cases. Or I'm thinking here just off the top of my head about magical papyri, or if you go to Pompeii, you see graffiti, on the walls that's quoting Homer. You have more people participating in these kinds of activities in a limited sense. They maybe aren't going to go out and write prose literature, but they're familiar well enough because of their exposure in the theater, because of their exposure via social expectations of literacy. We see some evidence of some more people being literate to some degree. So there have been arguments in the past about maybe this is where we place the gospel authors. Maybe they're kind of a mid-tier or something like that. This requires a little bit more consideration. But in terms of those reading and writing practices, we have to imagine a pretty narrow scope of people. And this is back to this idea of a literary network, having those conversations, having that particular training, fulfilling certain expectations relative to that literary training itself. So it's fairly limited and also laborious.
Who are the primitive Christians?
This is a term that you see quite often in early Christian scholarship or scholarship on early Christianity and Christian origins. It's something that I don't like because I think this idea of primitive buys into a lot of pernicious language related to what we were talking about in terms of, German Romanticism, and also constructions of ancient peoples. One place where I see this as really problematic is actually at the intersection of cognitive science and the study of religion. I mean, we tend to, because we think of people as primitive or ancient, we can start to make all kinds of claims because that means they're different, right? So they must have had different ways of memorizing than we did. And we might not have evidence for that, but it's something that we might state because we other them by calling them primitive. And obviously the term primitive for any peoples is fairly insulting and not descriptive of anything except, a self-importance of contemporary ideas of culture. So I like to stay away from it. I think that the term itself comes in part from this idea of the Christian in German. So it's a way to simultaneously create a sense of they're almost childlike, which back to Herder is something he says about Jewish people, actually. So a childlike mentality, or create more antiquity and the idea of primitive being truly ancient for Christianity than just talking about some people interested in Jesus, right? So I think depending on when and how it's used, it is participating in a lot of different kinds of discourses that I think are across the board problematic. And it is just a term, whether we're talking about the study of religion and Christian origins or in general, that we just should not use.
Can you tell us about Irene Perano's tracing the frequency with which Roman writers engaged in the practice of creating quasi-fictional scenarios centered on untold episodes and unexplored existing narratives?
So she wrote an interesting book called The Roman Fake. Is that the one that you're thinking of here?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So she, I think she goes by Perano Garrison now as well. But she wrote a book. I think there's a longer title, but there's something about the Roman fake. And she's writing about this interesting practice of basically imitating other authors. I mean, the book deals with a lot of different subjects. And Tom Goy's book, too, on anonymous writing with Harvard University Press is another, contribution to this general field of thinking about our categories. But we have to remember that in the Second Sophistic, which is something that, we have to place early Christian literature within that ambit, but also in antiquity, it was quite common to write in the name of other people. It was quite common to imitate other writers. There's nothing like copyright in antiquity per se. Plagiarism, you're not going to get knocked for that. In fact, I would say it's celebrated in many contexts in antiquity. If you can imitate the greats, that's a good thing, right? So if you can show proper emulation of great authors with your own sort of innovations and twist, that's a good thing. And so also trading on the name and recognition of an established literary figure is also going to be a good thing. This is why by the 2nd century, we get so many imitators of Paul and Paul's letters. There's a trade-off on him as sort of this foundational figure of early Christianity by the 2nd, 3rd century. So she deals with that. How do we, and I'm not going to take responsibility for explaining her whole thesis, but that is what she points out for us. And she's somebody who is influential to my book as well, because she helps us understand that writing practice as not being something offensive or something that we should feel discomfort about, but that imitation, fakeness, this is something that is a good way to help us reconceptualize what exactly is going on when, say, Matthew takes Mark and doesn't change a lot, right? He just kind of puts his own spin on it. These kinds of activities were very normal.
What does Dio Chrysostom say about teachers teaching on street corners?
Oh, gosh. What I remember is that don't use them. So I think I might have talked about this in the book in terms of writing practices and like literary practices in general. Like, how do you go to school, essentially? Like, that was one thing that I wanted to address. This is something Rawson talks about, too. That you could, ideally, you're going to be educated in Rome or in Athens by an established grammaticos or some other kind of teacher, or you're going to have one in your house. Interesting if you're wealthy enough. Interestingly, by the time you get to someone like Augustine, he's like, I didn't need a tutor. I was just like so innately intelligent that I just like magically learned to read and I understood everything. So you get different variations on how this happened. But there were these, speakers on street corners as well as teachers on street corners, according to these authors, that you could hire as a teacher for the day, or, might gather like a group together to do some pontificating. And especially if they're affordable, that's probably a sign they're no good. So that's what I remember, but I would have to look up the specific passage.
What does Pliny say about knowledge and memorization of excerpts and phrases?
He talks about this at various points, but one area that I recall is essentially what we might call publication in a sense. So this would be a way that people would exchange within their literary networks, their writings or their ideas. And you might excerpt a friend's writing in your own work or memorize it as part of a speech. But this was a way to essentially put forward or sort of like soft launch somebody's ideas in antiquity. So he talks about it in that sense, I think, at various points. And it gives us an idea of how these networks would have exchanged their writings, would have appreciated them. Someone else who talks about this too is Cicero. So we do see these ancient authors actually identify their own networks. And there's been some great work. Josh Howley, too, has done this with Aulus Gellius about how, within his own circle, he's quoting some people that we might then imagine or be able to reconstruct who were part of his school in Athens. So when we see this kind of repetition of phrases and memorization of one another's poetry or writings, it gives us some interesting clues to how these people were interacting and, again, sort of soft launching or publishing their works.
How was Philo of Alexandria like Pliny and Quintilian, and how were Greek Jewish scholars indistinguishable from non-Jewish Greek intellectuals?
Well, Philo is elite in that sense of being economically elite and socially elite. I mean, he's related to the royal family by marriage. And, he's in Alexandria, a huge intellectual hub, obviously. And I would also class him among the Middle Platonists. I had to take a Greek class. I can tell you he's very hard to translate. So he's also participating in a kind of, showcasing of his literary skill that is common among the truly elite and talented of this period. So he's, he demonstrates the same kind of learning, the same kinds of potential, the same kinds of craftsmanship that you hear from someone like Quintilian, who talks to us. He's one of the big sources on how education worked and how literacy worked in antiquity. But again, among this kind of rarefied group to some extent. I think if I could kind of tweak a little bit, he's indistinguishable in terms of objective craft technique. Skill, right? Education. What his difference is, which I think is key, is that he is participating in something that Arthur Urbano has talked about, which is whether it's Philo or Josephus and Paul, actually. But a lot of talented Jewish writers and thinkers of this period trying to point out that if you really love Plato, well, Moses said it first. The great antiquity of Judaism in this period, the knowledge that something like the Hebrew scriptures are older than anything else that anybody's claiming. And remember, Rome's got to have a little bit of self-consciousness here because they're stealing everything from the Greeks, and they have really no right to. They also have, a great fondness for North Africa and for Egyptian culture, which they, translate into the built environment by like taking things like obelisks, right? And, borrowing off of those cultural currents. And so to have knowledge that here is a tradition, a set of holy books, and a people with even greater antiquity is something that we see Josephus, Philo, Paul, and so forth use to argue that they really do. They are the holders and the true inheritors of a cultural tradition that has great currency in the 1st and 2nd centuries. And I think that this is really important for quite a few reasons. Among them is the attractiveness of Paul's message, for example, or the Gospels. Why would anybody care, right? If you're not yourself, somebody who believes in a Jewish Messiah or, has encountered Jesus yourself, why would you care if you're in Rome, for example? Well, Paul is offering a greater antiquity and genealogy than perhaps some families could claim for themselves in the 1st or 2nd centuries, at a time when being able to identify, your family lineage is a huge deal, as we talked about with Matthew or Luke. But say you're an Ostian merchant who, you have a family tree that you can trace back to some extent, but you're kind of new money. To be able to claim, that you are an adopted son of Abraham is going to make you more ancient than any other family, right, in town. And so I think that tied to a greater antiquity, a deeper genealogy, a more ancient peoples, a more, ancient set of scriptures. These are scriptures that were also used for purposes like dream interpretation. We know that Judeans were doing this as well. I think it helps us explain a little bit why there was an interest in Judaism in this period, and sort of this cultural competition that was going on. So Philo embodies some of that as well.
What is the Satirica, and what links the Gospels with it?
This is a text that is variously dated to the first or second centuries. It's attributed to somebody in the sort of ambit of Nero at times, but more recent scholarship, like Ulrich Roth's work on it in the Classical Quarterly, has, I think, pretty conclusively demonstrated that it's probably an anonymous writer in the second century. But it's a series of vignettes that are somewhat inspired by something called Milesian tales. So it's sort of embodying this idea of repetition we've talked about, or emulation of other stories. But it's kind of a series of satirizing accounts of life in this period through various characters and different kinds of situations. So, hence Satyricon. It's a satire. So the interesting thing about it to me, and the way I use it in the book, is we mentioned a couple of scenes already, but one is this character Trimalchio. And there's so much going on with Trimalchio. Another scholar that I can recommend on Trimalchio and what's called the Scena is John Bodell. So John Bodell and Ulrich Roth have done a lot of great work on this. But Trimalchio is this really ridiculous character. He's kind of new money, like we were just talking about. He can't read or write, but he has people around him who can. He has these like ornate dinner parties, and he has this big fancy house, but he does everything a little bit wrong. Like if everybody's going to play like a ball game, he doesn't quite know the rules. If he tries to be fancy and put on airs, he gets it a little bit wrong because he just doesn't quite know what he's doing. And so that's where the humor, he's like a satirization of a rich, fancy person. But he has this one scene where he has a dinner party. He hears a cock crow. He assumes that is a sign of death, and he starts to freak out. And at his dinner party, he says that he's going to impart his last will and testament to his friends, that he wants them to eat his body after he dies. So it's very much kind of a funerary meal sort of setting, which is interesting when you compare the literary approach of the Gospels, right? There's a lot more to say about the so-called Last Supper. I've written elsewhere about how the Last Supper seems to actually come from Paul, who claims it's a divination experience. So there's some stuff to unpack there. But if we're thinking about a literary approach, this idea of a funerary meal exists, whether, again, the Satyricon is first century or second century, there's a way to write that story. And you see that in something like the Satyricon, and then obviously in the Gospels. The other thing that I zero in on in that set of stories is what's called the Woman of Ephesus. And so this is a story about a woman whose husband dies. He's entombed, and she and her maid go to the tomb, and she's weeping in the tomb over his dead body. And there's a Roman soldier who has been tasked with guarding 3 men crucified. So you have 3 crosses with 3 men crucified, and he's there guarding the bodies to make sure the families don't come and take the bodies down off the cross. He hears this woman sobbing in the tomb. He goes inside. He tries to comfort her. He ends up bringing her food and wine. They eat and drink, and then you can guess what happens next. I won't say. There's a suggestion, like what's the thing that your mind tends to go to when you have a full stomach and you're a little drunk. In other words, she gets over the dead husband pretty quick. Mm-hmm. And so after 3 days and 3 nights, they come out of the tomb after their little sojourn. And he sees that one of the men on the cross has been taken down. The family has come and stolen the body. And so he starts freaking out because he knows it's a death sentence for him. He abandoned his post. But then they concoct the idea of taking the dead husband's body, leaving the tomb empty, and putting the dead husband's body on the cross because it's, the right decomposition and it's the right amount of time. I mean, they don't say this in the story, but that's the implication. I think what the story says is, why not make a dead man useful? So put that guy's body up on the cross to hide that he abandoned his post, and then they can go right off in the sunset together. But obviously, these motifs of like three men on the cross, the soldier, the empty tomb, some of it is implied, but the imagery is all there, right? So again, you have this chicken and egg argument. If it's a first century text, are the Gospels aware of this? And so they're reconstructing some formula. And the Widow of Ephesus is a Milesian tale. So even there, right, like there might be some aspects of this that the Gospel writers are aware of. Or is it that the Satyricon is a second century writing? If it is the case that it's anonymous second century writing, is it
Reversing the dependence.
right? Like, is it making fun? And it's a satire, right? So is it making fun? It's read the Gospels, and it's taking a Milesian tale and coupling it with the Gospels and making fun of the Gospels. It's an interesting puzzle. You're not going to solve it. You can weigh averages for what seems more plausible. I mean, again, with the title Satyricon, I would say that the latter is probably more plausible. But you can see where you get the idea that there are a lot of stories out there that you can borrow from, right? Or there are a lot of motifs that are going to both entertain and inform in antiquity that don't require what we started with, which is, this idea that the gospel writers are just faithfully recording some oral history of a Christian folk. That to me is, I do think there's a kernel of truth in the idea that these texts obviously were used within Christian communities. I'm not denying that. But that doesn't necessarily account for their composition and their authorship when you make these kinds of comparisons that we've talked about today.
So you think that it's more probable that the Satyricon is kind of satirizing the Gospels?
Yeah, I'm gonna regret answering that, but yeah, I always like to hedge my bets, but I think I have a tendency to think that we have a lot. I think we probably have more texts from outside a Christian ambit in the second century, for example, that are aware of gospel literature and making a parody or satirizing it, than we can either, really reconstruct in terms of like scholarly expectation, or maybe it's a little uncomfortable, right? To figure out that like, oh, people are reading the Gospels, and other than like Celsus, right? Like Contra Celsum, like where Celsus is clearly like not feeling it with the Gospels, like they were just not accepted, right? Or Christian literature was really kind of given side eye in the second century by many elites who then encounter it again, like these educated elites that we're talking about are cultural elites. So off the top of my head, Satyricon, if it is second century, could be making fun of Christianity. We already know Lucian is doing it. He explicitly does it in something like Peregrinus. I mentioned Phlegon. He's aware of it, and he basically lumps it in with paradoxography from what we can understand, but that's a reconstruction. I know that there are scholars who dance with the idea that P.G. Walsh did this. I am not related to P.G. Walsh, but great scholar. And I think, I don't want to speak for Joel Rillahan, but I think, I could have a conversation with him about it. But it's possible that Apuleius, the Golden Ass, is aware of early Christianity and maybe looking askance at it. So there's a list, right? There are a few authors who are even either explicitly doing it, or I think you can say they're making a little bit of fun.
I've also wondered if anyone's compared to Satyricon about those free crucified guys with Josephus, because in his autobiography about the two men die, one guy survives. After Josephus begged Titus to let them to have them taken down from the cross and have a physician tend to them.
That's an interesting point. So, I mean, I was actually thinking about, it's ironic, I was thinking about it this morning. I didn't know we were going to talk about this, but when I read the Satyricon for the first time and started putting this together, I was actually at a research library that I'm going to go to in a few weeks. So I was thinking about the last time I was there, driving in today, because when I discovered that comparison, I was like, well, surely somebody wrote about this. Like there's got to be like, a few articles out there about this or like a book chapter somewhere. And I just couldn't find it. And I was at a research library where I could spend all day, like looking through a database and doing
Mhm.
searches and like going into the stacks and pulling books. And it was sort of a marvel to me that I couldn't find it. So that's the kind of conversation I would like to see people have. But it might be related to this, hypothesis I just threw out that, when it's making fun of early Christianity, it's a little, it's complicated to think about and write about. And to bring Josephus into it, I mean, obviously that's been something. Is it Steve Mason who wrote a book about Josephus and the Gospels? I might be misremembering that. But there has been a movement along those lines to think about how these motifs cross this kind of literature. So that would be interesting.
He talks about Luke's use of Josephus.
Yeah.
So it makes me wonder. It does make me, and Josephus in the New Testament, I think that's what it's called. It makes me wonder if the Satyricon could be alternatively making fun of Josephus, or maybe maybe it's making fun of both, assuming it really was written in the 2nd century, though.
Yeah, so the argument for the 2nd century, if you have a second, do you have a second? I can
Sure.
why.
Let's talk
Um,
about it.
okay, so I'm using the work of Ulrich Roth here. So I recommend anybody who's interested read the source. Like, don't trust me. Go read the article because you're relying on my interpretation, which I don't know if I trust myself half the time. But Ulrich Roth wrote for the Classical Quarterly, I think more than one article, but wrote one article about how there are 3 manumitted enslaved persons referenced in the Satyricon. And they have names, something like Star. I can't remember the other 2. I don't want to guess, but I
Sure.
know one was Star. But anyway, in Pliny's letters, so this is Pliny of Pliny and Trajan. In Pliny's letters, he manumits 3 enslaved persons with the same names. So the conclusion is, well, whoever wrote the Satyricon was actually reading Pliny, because it's just too coincidental unless you want to start, building a scaffold that tries to argue that Pliny is naming, enslaved persons after the Satyricon. I guess you could make that case, but you see what I mean. Like, there are other arguments in this article to make
I
the
see.
case that the Satyricon is not a 1st century, Neronian product, but an anonymous series of vignettes from the 2nd century reflecting on things like Pliny's letters. What I would recommend, so this is probably work I'm going to have to do now, that I say it, is figure out who else is in Pliny's circle, right? That you might be able to find other evidence within the Satyricon of an engagement with a particular literary circle of people. And that would, I think, send you further down that path of trying to figure out, how do I date this thing? So a combination of that kind of work plus looking at a manuscript tradition to the extent that you can reconstruct it would be how you start to figure out, how do I confirm this? But that's why I found Ulrich Roth's work very convincing for the Pliny connection. That helped me, essentially abandon the 1st century idea in my own mind. So that's where that comes from. So if you bring in Josephus to that, again, another kind of interesting crossover with the caution that we can't always assume everybody had everything that we're thinking of. So that's why I like to, in terms of texts, so that's why I like to think in terms of tropes or topoi, or kind of broadly on technique. So the literary borrowings from Greco-Roman literature that you see in Jewish writings or Christian writings, it's all Greco-Roman literature. And that's really kind of the message at end, is that, they're all sort of using similar kinds of style and structure because that's how they've been trained.
Can you tell us about the popularity of resurrection empty tomb narratives among figures like Flagon of Tralles?
Yeah, so that's really, I don't want to step on Richard Miller too much. That's really his book on this motif. I just add to it in my book. I found his work interesting, and then I found more examples. Flagon has some examples of, he likes ghosts, like amorous ghosts. So it's interesting that seems to be a big theme in antiquity as well. Because it's not just ghosts, but it's ghosts that, like, are still tied to their bodies in some way. So he has some of that kind of discussion, but he also has accounts of, other bodies that are missing. And the assumption again there is usually that if the physical body is gone, or if there is some kind of cosmological sign in correspondence with the death of the individual or something like their cremation, that's a sign of apotheosis or some kind of divination process. So you see this with like the idea that, well, a comet shot across the sky when so-and-so died, therefore that was their body going up to heaven. So you have that kind of imagery all over the place, and it's there too.
What is the link between Mark's account of the empty tomb narrative of Callirhoes?
So this is a Greek novel by someone called Keraton. And there's a scene where the presumption, so a lot of these Greek novels are very like Shakespearean in the sense that usually you have like star-crossed lovers or like, a boy and a girl who like grew up together in like a small town and then something happens. It's usually, like a pirate kidnapping or, she's sold off in marriage to somebody else. And so like, the lover has to find her and like bring her home. And so in this particular story, she's presumed to be, have died and been entombed. It turns out that, very Romeo and Juliet, she wasn't actually dead. She's probably in a coma or something like that. But her would-be boyfriend goes to her tomb and sees that her body is missing from the tomb. So he starts crying out, what god has stolen my girlfriend and made her into a god? That has to be the only explanation if her tomb is empty. In reality, some pirates broke into her tomb to make sure there weren't any jewels buried with her, and when they realized she was alive and awake, they took her too. So the story, he has to figure out that she was kidnapped by pirates, and he has to chase her throughout the empire and so forth. But I like that passage because it's particularly interesting that the initial reaction to a empty tomb is, oh, that person's a god, right? Like right away, that's not pirates stole her, maybe she's not dead. It goes right to, well, she must be a goddess at this point, or a god has taken her. So that idea of the bodily, we can't quite say resurrection in this case necessarily, but the idea of the physical body absence representing a kind of, I hate to use the word supernatural state because it is natural in their cosmological construction here, but I'll say supernatural to just kind of get the feeling like, they've become a deity or they've become a supernatural being. They're no longer tied to their body, but they're still alive in some form.
And I'd like to remind everybody that the link to the origins of early Christian literature will be in the description below and also in the pinned comment. And with that being said, thank you very much for joining me today, Robyn.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.